My name is Raphael Bostic. I'm a professor here at the Price School of Public Policy, and I'm affiliated with the Bedrosian Center on Governance and the Public Enterprise. It's a distinct pleasure to have you here with us today to talk about the issue of immigrants and refugees coming into the United States. It's an issue that's been present in our political campaign, and it's something that I think there is much that people need to learn and understand, and so I'm really glad that this is part of our program. I want to say a few words about the Bedrosian Center for those of you who aren't familiar with it. The Bedrosian Center is a center on governance, and the way I describe it is when we think about the policy space, there are really two aspects to it. The first is designing policy and figuring out what you want to do, and then the second part is figuring out how you do it, the implementation side of policy. And Bedrosian really focuses on that implementation of policies aspect of doing policy. And in that regard, it is relevant for just about every policy issue that you might think about. And to make that point, the center has actively sought out other partners to do programs with. So we've done programs with our Transportation Center, with the Schwarzenegger Institute, with just about every center, the Lusk Center for Real Estate. And today we're happy to have a partnership with the Safe Communities Institute. SCI is one of the flagship programs that we have, and it's very unique in the context of universities, and it's really a pleasure to have them here with us and to contribute to this program. And I want to thank SCI for bringing the program together, because many of these folks are your folks, so it's good to have them. So I wanted to give the director of the Safe Communities Institute, Frank Chiambo, an opportunity to give his welcome and to introduce the panelists.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Raphael. It's a pleasure to be here. And again, this is the first collaborative effort between the Bedrosian Center and the Safe Communities Institute. And for those of you who aren't really familiar with the Safe Communities Institute, it's been around for 75 years. It was established in 1946, right after World War II and the Zoot Suit riots. And it was established to teach local law enforcement how to deal with juvenile delinquency, gangs, drugs, and the problems that were affecting youth. Well, for 65 years, the DCI was one of the premier executive education programs for law enforcement. But about 5 years ago, the university decided that, you know, the problems facing society today in terms of security and safety go far beyond just juvenile delinquency. It really will take a whole of community approach, utilizing multi-jurisdictional and multidisciplinary approaches. And so the Safe Communities Institute was founded actually a couple of years ago. We've started with courses for senior leaders in law enforcement, fire, public health, and education. We're doing research, we're doing community events, and we're also organizing programs in homegrown violent extremism. So we're very pleased today to be co-hosting with Bedrosian this program on the refugees in the United States and actually the refugee issues throughout the world. We have an outstanding panel. First, I'd like to introduce Professor Cherry Short. Cherry is the Assistant Dean for Assistant Dean of Global and International Initiatives in the DOARC, I'm going to say this for the first time, the DOARC Peck School of Social Work. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right.
Done a great job.
First time, it's a tough name. Our second panelist is Maimouna Hussein Katan, and she is the director of the TIA Foundation, which is an agency in Orange County that works with refugees coming from all over the world. She has a very interesting story also, personal story to tell. And then last but not least is a colleague that actually teaches in our program occasionally. It's Ehsan Zafar. Ehsan is an attorney. He came from DC to be with us today. Ehsan is the senior advisor to Secretary Jeh Johnson of the Department of Homeland Security, and he advises the Secretary on issues of civil rights and civil liberties, and he has a huge repertoire of knowledge and experience in that regard. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Raphael, our moderator.
Thank you, Frank. And I do want to say again, it's really a pleasure to have this partnership, and I'm hopeful that, that we'll do more of these sort of programs. Now, if you've ever been to a Bedrosian event, you know we don't really do PowerPoint slides and presentations and all that kind of stuff. We like to get right into the conversation, but we're not going to do that this time, just because I want to give each of our panelists an opportunity, if they want, to say a little more about their organization, just so that you understand sort of the things that they do. And I thought we'd start with Maimuna, if you would like to talk about your foundation.
Yes, so I'm the director and co-founder of the TIA Foundation. We're based in Orange County. I'd also like to clarify we're not a resettlement agency, we're a support organization. I guess it would be ECBO, but we're a support organization in Orange County for refugees after their 90-day process. So after they've been resettled by either World Relief, East African Community Center, the International Rescue Committee, TIA steps in and helps with basic necessities, employment basics, vocational English classes. We also provide services for children that vary from soccer to tutoring, arts and recreation to help them feel acclimated and welcome in their new neighborhoods and environment. This is very passionate to me personally because my family and I came here as refugees in the early 80s. My father was first resettled by the International Rescue Committee, and my mother and I reunited with him a year later. That was in the early 80s. And TIA ended up being my thesis project, and it's been in existence now for about 6 years.
That's very interesting, and you touched on a lot of things that I definitely want to return to, but welcome. It's really good to have you on campus. Ehsan, anything you want to say about your role in DHS?
Will say I'm a little uncomfortable being here because I'm a Bruin.
Okay.
Now I'm feeling a lot better. But this was such an important topic that I
Figured you'd come on campus anyway.
That's right. That's right. Trying to forego my discomfort. Thank you to the Bedrosian Center for hosting us, to Frank and the Safe Communities Institute. This is a very important topic, immigration, immigrants, and refugees. Like Tia, I'm a refugee as well, and I now work for one of the organizations that helps resettle refugees. I was a refugee from the Middle East. We were actually immigrants in Kuwait. So my family was there for 3 generations, and we were there during the first Gulf War. And so after trying to find a way out of that country during the war, we eventually ended up at a refugee camp in between kind of a no man's land in Jordan and Kuwait. I was younger, so it was more of an adventure for me. But we spent quite a lot of time there. And then we moved to the US, a suburb of LA. At that time, my name wasn't Ehsan Zafar, it was Ehsan Hussein. So we were a little surprised still to find out that there was a lot of bigotry in the United States against that name in particular. The city that we moved to, a lot of folks had sent their sons, brothers to fight overseas against Saddam Hussein. And one thing you find with bigotry is that there's usually paired with ignorance. And Saddam Hussein was not on my friends list. I had lost my home due to him. I just happened to share a surname. And when the violence against our family started becoming a little crazy, when somebody torched our car and things started getting a little ridiculous, my dad changed my name to his first name, which caused all kinds of other problems. But I tell that story because 18 years after my name was changed, we elected Barack Hussein Obama. So look how far we've come. But I also tell that story because we still have a lot of work to do. There was, as it still is, a backlash against the election of President Obama. There are still a lot of issues we're dealing with in terms of immigrants and refugees. And one of the reasons my office exists, it's the Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties at the Department of Homeland Security, is to ensure that the government itself, when carrying out policies that keep all of us safe, doesn't abridge on our guaranteed constitutional rights. So that's the work that we do. We do it by reviewing immigration policy, by talking to audiences such as yourselves, by taking in complaints, and many, many more things, which I'm happy to share during the course of this engagement. But it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having us.
Well, it's good to have you here as well, and it's good to hear your story, to place some context, both of you, about the topic we're going to discuss. Cherry, is there anything you wanted to add here?
Oh, sure. I've got a lot to add.
Institutionally first.
Don't worry, Raphael, I will. I'd like to thank Frank and the Bedrosian Center for organizing this today. It's one of these situations that is extremely troubling to me. I come from Britain, so I was in the Tony Blair's administration, and I was the Race and Equality Commissioner for Wales as well. And I oversee a great deal of, I oversee all the issues relating to immigration and race relations, but I also was the chairperson of the Refugee Council. And it opened my eyes to situations that sometimes we don't focus on at all because it's not affecting us. And the shock of it was immense. And I am a forensic social worker as well as the Associate Dean in the School of Social Work. So I'm not new to the feeling of people being distressed or in poverty and all those sort of issues. But I must say the refugee situation is dire. And as human beings, we have a responsibility.
So thank you, Cherry. I wanted to start with just sort of giving everyone to a level set of information about how the process works, right? So how does a refugee wind up coming to the United States or going to any country, actually? Ehsan, do you want to speak to that process?
Yeah, I can talk at least from our perspective in the beginning of the process. The refugee resettlement process is voluntary, so it's not a process whereby we go out and when I'm speaking we, I'm saying the United States government at large. It's not just my department, Department of Homeland Security, that manages the resettlement process, but a number of other government agencies, for instance, including the State Department, and also international organizations such as the UN. So the UN interviews individuals who apply for refugee resettlement, and then they work with the State Department and the Resettlement Support Center to conduct even more further interviews, and then DHS steps in to conduct even further interviews and security background checks. And this process can take several months, anywhere from 12 or 13 months at the minimum to 2 years or more. And this process is happening overseas, these interviews that are being conducted. Then there's various additional background checks that happen. For Syrian refugees in particular, there's an enhanced screening process. And then after those background checks are conducted, if the individuals are accepted into the United States or admitted into the United States, then there's another series of procedures that happens in terms of resettling them in the U.S. and providing them a certain level of support, such as clothes and furniture and things like that. And that goes on for about 90 days. And then organizations such as yours step in because often refugees need far more assistance after 90 days. And then we're lucky to have organizations such as yours that step in to provide some of that assistance.
So Maimouna, talk a little bit about that experience. So the refugee, they've come to this country, they've been here for 90 days, gone through that first round of assimilation, if you will, and then they're handed to you. Can you talk a little bit about sort of what your usual experience is in terms of how refugees do when they, what kind of state of mind are they in when they get to that 90-day handoff period? And then what kind of things do you do as an organization to try to ease that, to make it easier?
Yeah, I think a lot of the refugees, this is speaking from experience, the refugees we meet, they kind of hit the ground running, and their first priority is just their basic needs, their education, their employment, taking care of their family. But like most victims of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, those symptoms don't come out until they feel safe in their new environment. So it takes a few months before you see the families become comfortable enough to tell you about what they went through and how they got here, and it takes a lot of trust. We meet families either through resettlement agencies, by word of mouth, also through Department of Social Services in Orange County. We were talking about individuals that thought that they would come here and live this amazing life and start over. You know, there's just gold growing on trees. And but if in Orange County, I think LA County operates differently. In Orange County specifically, if you are a single refugee, you're receiving refugee cash assistance, and through that program, you're living off of $300 a month. If you're married and you don't have children, you still qualify for the RCA program, and that's about $550 a month. And then if you have children, you're not receiving refugee cash assistance. You're introduced to the CalWORK system, and we have families, you know, average a family of 6 will receive $900 in aid per month in Orange County. I'm sharing this information with you because they had these promises getting here. They had to go through a long vetting process, but once they're kind of situated, they're considered invisibly homeless pretty much. You know, they have to figure out, are they going to live in a motel? Can they afford the apartment that they were set up in? You know, are they going to stay with a family friend? Do they have family friends? So it's very disheartening to see this transition happen. And if they are lucky, then that means maybe they have some kind of community, either an ethnic community or religious organization that supports them. But even through that type of support, it's not usually monetary.
And to what extent is language a barrier? Right? Do most, so you say this is voluntary, do most refugees, in your experience, select places that they know they'll be able to communicate? Like, what would you say the thought process is for how people decide where they want to go? They know they want to leave the camps, yeah. Right? That's a tough place to live, but there are many, many options. Like, how does that work? And either any of the three of you, because you all have experience with this, how do people make those choices?
I mean, I just can say from my personal experience and from what I've seen, I don't work on the international side of the refugee process, but what I've seen in some of the refugees that I've spoken with is one of the reasons among many is a presence of family in the country that they're trying to go to. And that was a consideration for us, for my family.
Yeah, that is certainly a very important point. I think that if you look at Britain, for example, I can speak very well on that because I know the process. Even if you have family in the UK, the idea is that you can join them from a refugee camp. So we see Calais, which is called the jungle, and it's just been mowed down. I don't know if you know, people keep up with this, but it's one of the most horrific places. I've been there. It is absolutely, you wouldn't want a dog staying in Calais in the jungle. I mean, it's just absolutely awful. And of course, people risk their lives to get out of it. And we've seen people trying to get out of it and lost their lives in the Channel. Hence, we have to close Calais. It's quite an interesting development, really, because people have been saying for years this place needs to be closed down, but it's not taken on board. But once they started, people started to go in numbers, and it's raising awareness that this camp is so awful. Then there's this, this feeling then, oh, we got to do something about it, and therefore let's close the jungle. So okay, so we're going to close the jungle. Where are we going to put these people? These people. And then there's this long debate of where they should actually go. And it's not a political seller, refugees. You've got to remember that. Britain has just got a new Prime Minister, Theresa May, and we all know that it's no good saying that we're going to take as many refugees as possible into the country, because people resist that, and they resist it for all different reasons. But they resist it too because people don't understand sometimes the crisis that is actually happening. And also they don't see it as their responsibility, which is another interesting factor. Plus also, they don't see it as something that they should have to give up their resources so somebody else can have something else, And the whole idea about people coming in to take our houses, our jobs, use our healthcare system. I mean, it's a very, individualistic attitude. So it's not a vote winner. That's clear. It's clearly defined that if you're running for any political system, which I have, it's not a vote winner to say anything about refugees, because it's also very difficult. I just want to say one other thing. America takes in 2,290 refugees from Syria, okay? Which is, there is 4.2 million Syrian refugees at the moment, and they take in 2,290, which is 0.0005% of the total. I mean, come on, we don't have to really think what humanitarians we are. We need to think, well, this isn't right. Something needs to be done about this.
So I definitely want to spend some time talking about the politics of this and the governance of this, because it's an important component to everything that we're talking about here. And in particular, the voluntary nature of everything, right? So the idea that the refugees have to participate voluntarily, and then the countries have to agree to take refugees. And there's been tremendous debate about this here. Some would argue that the whole Brexit decision was driven by something along these lines. And so it is quite important that we stay mindful of that. I wanted to, but before I get too political, I want to keep it personal, right? So I want us to think about the refugee experience. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or insights about how refugees experience the relocation, the resettlement, and the integration process. Cherry, you've done some work on this?
I have, but even before you go to that process, Raphael, there is the feeling that when somebody's in a refugee camp, and all the trauma that you were actually talking about, all the trauma that one experienced in that camp. There's children that's not accompanied by any adults, right? You think about it. In camps, there's, we're not the homogeneous population. There's all sorts of different people. There are criminalities. There's people that are pedophiles. There's all sorts of people preying on the vulnerable. People are eager to get out of refugee camps. And often, when countries actually open their borders and say we'll have a few of them, they're eager to leave. It's, people want to leave. We all want the best for us and our children. Everyone, if you did a survey in this room, that's what we all want, okay? But people who are refugees in these camps, they don't have that luxury. Education don't exist. The whole situation is one of torturous dilemma. So if you take them out of that situation and you put them in another situation now, I, who have come from Britain, who, one wouldn't say I was fearful of anything. I don't as far as I know, have suffered any traumatic experiences. Perhaps I could find a few, but nothing like a refugees. I mean, but I'm coming to a new country. Everything is different to me, right? And I have a lot of support system. I have a husband who understands the system, but I just feel totally, when I was first here, on the periphery. It takes you a considerable period of time to leave your country, to come into a totally new place. Plus a lot of people can't speak the language. I could speak English, come into a new place, right, and struggle with all these issues. So it's not something that one thinks lightly, oh, I'm going to pack up now and leave my home, or I'm going to, I'm going to go to, a new country and everything's going to be fine. Even if one thinks that, which some people in their own minds, because you have to really have a mindset as well for the things that are currently occurring and happening. So the mindset is that things are going to be better. Things have to be better. But when you get there, you're suffering from PSD, you're suffering from other trauma-related incidents. Plus also, your children have lack of education. They haven't probably been in a camp for all 5 and 3 and 4 years. They just have no understanding of what the system is about. And then the support structure of $300 a month. I mean, I spend that on a meal. Well, not exactly, but but when you think about it, though, I mean, it's just heart-rendering. It's a feeling of, we have to do better. I do think we do. I do think we do.
So I wanted, Maimuna, did you have anything you wanted to add on top of that in terms of how you see the refugees actually experiencing their new environment, and they come from a very difficult place. They're going through trauma, but do you have a sense that they see potential? Are they on some level hopeful and optimistic? Like how do you see that the mix of perspectives that they might have?
It depends on what country the family's from. So every country, there may have been different reasons as to why they came here and their expectations. I know my family in particular, my parents left Ethiopia in '75, went to a refugee camp in Somalia. They thought they would be processed, come to the US, live happily ever after. But actually, that's when they were in the camp, that's where my parents met. They got married on the camp. I was born on the camp. 8 years went by. So average wait time for refugees we speak of in these refugee camps is about 17 years. So they were very lucky to have been there for about 8 years. I have families that stayed a lot longer, into the 90s, and then had to go into Kenya to another refugee camp. So there was all this migration that was happening in East Africa. And then upon arrival, I guess the idea is, well, things are better than they were before, so you just have to kind of make it work. And many of the parents are similar to mine, where they believe that one day when things get better, they're going to go back home. So this isn't home, this is just a safe space for them to get situated until things are better. Then they can go back, maybe buy some property, retire, go back to their homeland. So the idea in my family wasn't that we would be here forever, but then you see all these decades go by. My sisters and I grew up here. We're now in our 30s. So it depends on who you're talking to. Then I could meet a family from Afghanistan or from Iraq who had the ability to maybe translate back home, came here with what's called a special immigration visa. They might be promised this new life as a special immigration visa, working with the US government as a translator, but then you get here and then you start all over just like a refugee would have to, and your degrees don't transfer over. So there's many layers, and it depends on who you're talking to, what country they're from, why and how they got here, their process, their expectations. But there's this sense of resilience. Just like the professor here mentioned that, you know, only a small % of Syrians were resettled. But you have to imagine what they went through to get here. You know, I think on average we resettle about 70,000 refugees per year, but about 85 this year, yeah. So the individuals that do get here, they've gone through so much that you're talking about the most resilient individuals we had to interview to go through that process.
So Ehsan, thank you for that, Maimouna, because there's really, I don't think people really appreciate the diversity of refugee pathways, right? You know, today we're very focused on sort of the Syrian and Middle Eastern dislocation that's happened in the last 2 or 3 years. But 17-year wait is quite a bit different from anything that I think is in anyone's mind, so that's helpful. And I'm wondering, Ehsan, does the U.S. government have different processes depending on where you come from, or is there a standard approach that we use for all refugees on the domestic side? So I'm wondering if you have any ideas on that.
There's a standard, very regimented process for reviewing and admitting refugees. However, the government, DHS, the State Department, does take known country conditions into account and looks at the particular environment you know, that refugees are coming from. So a country like Iraq may be very different than a country like Ethiopia or Somalia or Afghanistan. So that's taken into account. And back to the point of the number of, you know, where the refugees are kind of coming from. The top 5 countries in the last fiscal year were Burma, Syria, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Iraq, and Somalia. So that's the kind of mix of the majority of refugees coming into the country in the last fiscal year.
So it's from all over.
It's from all over.
And
Yeah,
some of them not in the news today.
Absolutely. I mean, the Syrian refugee crisis is undoubtedly an unprecedented humanitarian crisis, but there's still refugees from many other parts of the world.
Well, I think there are humanitarian crises all over the place.
Correct.
And you know, it's our ability to keep our attention on all of them to make sure that people and situations don't fall through the cracks. I wanted to turn to, you know, Dr. Short, you talked about the politics of refugee resettlement. I'm wondering if each of you had thoughts on the variation in reactions and experiences that happen on the ground in different places. So Maimouna, you talked a bit about the Orange County situation and how your organization primarily serves Orange County. Are there organizations like that in other counties in California or across the country? Like how lucky are the people who get to Orange County versus the people who happen to be in San Bernardino or Ventura?
It depends on the resettlement agencies that exist. So as I mentioned earlier, there's 2 resettlements in Orange County, World Relief and East African Community Center. And then in Los Angeles, there's about 9 resettlement agencies, but you have larger entities like the International Rescue Committee. They're based in LA and San Diego. So Orange County is just kind of that in-between zone. But to, you know, fall back on what you mentioned, how people respond. In Orange County in particular, I guess it's considered a red county. So there is this different conversation that happens about immigration that may not be happening in LA County or San Diego, for example. There's this sense of fear because of the media about what are refugees, how did they get here, what countries are they from. You have communities that maybe were resettled decades ago, like the East African community, who now that they're doing better, may not be as involved with newly arrived communities. So it's not the most welcoming of spaces.
And Ehsan, you see this from you're doing civil liberties, and you see this from a national perspective. Like, how is the U.S. doing? Like, do we rate as welcoming? Are there places that in the country that seem to have fewer issues that arise? Like, how would you assess the U.S. In terms from a community perspective?
Yeah, I think that question alone can probably be, I think, an entire
an
session.
hour or two. Yes.
But so I think I'm going to kind of give you a couple of answers to that question. The first is I mentioned my kind of story earlier, and what I didn't talk about was the flip side of that story. So after kind of word spread that in this small town there were refugees from this war, much to my mother's embarrassment, there was a number of news stories done on the refugees that have come from the Persian Gulf War. People saw they interviewed us, and it was on the TV, and then people started helping us out. I mean, we really had nothing, and many people, were very welcoming to us, to my family. I think that highlights something that is interesting or unique about the U.S., that there is a lot of bigotry in the United States, a lot of rhetoric in the United States that might be anti-immigrant and anti-refugee or anti-other, and that surprises us sometimes because we're a nation of refugees and a nation of immigrants. But on the flip side, there's also a lot of work done by people in general in terms of welcoming individuals that come to the United States. There's a lot of programs, for instance, in Massachusetts, such as the organization that you're running, that work with Syrian refugees in particular, in terms of welcoming folks to the country. We, as in the United States government, is consistently ramping up our quota for refugees. We were 85,000 in the last fiscal year, and we're aiming to accept 110,000 in this fiscal year 2017, so until next October. And the other thing I will mention is that some of these issues in terms of the welcoming nature of it, and I'm going to step away and stay away from the political part of it, but I will say that a lot of it, like I mentioned earlier, is based on ignorance. There is a lot of rhetoric against Syrian refugees in particular because of the perceived religious background of many of these individuals in that they are Muslims. But if you look at the statistics of accepted refugees, and don't quote me on the exact amount, but I believe it's 47% of Syrian refugees are actually not Muslim, that they're Christian. So there's a lot of, and your religion shouldn't matter in terms of whether you're accepted, and it doesn't matter whether you're accepted in the United States or not. But there is a lot of ignorance that drives some of the kind of pushback, not just in the United States, but in Europe and in Asia and many other countries that are looking to accept refugees.
So I'll ask this question to all of you. Are there things that the government should be doing or that we should be doing to reduce or eliminate that kind of ignorance? I mean, how might we be communicating with communities and the public to have these facts, these realities actually more broadly known?
Before, I'm not trying to speak twice in turn, but I will answer that question really quickly. It was my plan, so I've been working with the department to do a lot. The secretary is very interested in that specific question that you've raised, in that what is the responsibility of the government, in particular one of the agencies that helps resettle refugees, to set the record straight about refugees. I was planning on showing the video here, but the Bedrosian Center has a standing policy of not having PowerPoints. But if you do get the chance, and what we can do is I'm happy to if we can send that video out on the list, is we recruited the secretary to do a number of online videos, a couple of which went viral, on the refugee resettlement process, what our values are. Of course, we put folks through a security screening process, but at the same time, we spend considerable amount of taxpayer dollars to resettle refugees and vet refugees, and that's part of our value system as the United States. And talking about what that vetting process looks like, how many folks have come overseas. And he also, the secretary in particular, does a lot of engagements such as this with community members and organizations that may have concerns or questions about refugees coming into the United States, to set the record straight about why we help to accept refugees, why it's our moral responsibility to do so, why it's and how we go about accepting refugees.
So we will make sure that, I think everyone here had to sign up to come to this event, so we know how to get in touch with you. We'll make sure you have the link to the videos so you can see the type of communication that we're doing to try to set the record straight. I think that would be a useful thing, and then we can set the record straight for everybody else. Sherry, what's your take on this? So should we be doing, you've already articulated a view, what specific things might you suggest that we do to try to raise the profile of these facts?
I think part of the issue is the rhetoric that people hear consistently, that people who are different bring with them all sorts of other issues, and they're not really part of us, so to speak, in society. And once you start thinking about people that in a way that stating they don't deserve what you have, then there is issues about your thinking. And how can you change people's perception? Well, the way that governments can change people's perception is by stating what refugees actually bring to the community. And they bring, once they're resettled, people pay their taxes. That's never mentioned. They open businesses. Their children become doctors, lawyers, professionals. I mean, there's a whole wealth of things and experiences that they make our whole lives culturally in a way that you probably wouldn't have had if you had no refugees in your community. So it's how one perceives and how one actually think about it. But if you get the rhetoric, or you get the media actually highlighting, of course, they're going to, in every society, in every community, there are people who will not do the right thing. It's just the way of life, There will be some who are concentrating on something else. There will be some who are doing acts that you don't want them to do. I mean, that is life. But to taint everyone by saying that all these refugees, bring all these issues and problems. Refugees bring with them lots of qualities and good qualities to society. And it really bothers me to always, it's almost the approach of, you're not quite okay, but, that condescending way that you've got to be helped, because, refugees are seeking refuge, that's the word, refugees seeking refuge, because of all sorts of issues. They're seeking refuge because of war, political persecution, religious, sexual persecution. There's a whole list of things why people are actually seeking refuge. And governments too tend to put them in certain different categories. That's another thing that, you've got refugees and then you've got migrants. And, that's a really complex and complicated issue, because in people's minds, instead of seeing people as a whole, they begin to split them up and think of them, well, they're only coming here for their economic benefit, and why should we give up what we have to help them? when the reality is something else. And so socialization and education is the key to this as well, so that people understand this.
So I want to push back on two things. So migrants are going for economic benefits, aren't they? I mean, isn't the idea that they see better economic opportunities in other places, so they want to go and take advantage of them? And then oftentimes they'll send the resources back to the home country to be with families. So that's not, they're not wrong in that perspective, are
Well,
they?
they're not wrong in that perspective, but it's the way it's actually thought about. So the links then, the definition between refugees and migrants is so close in people's mind. People aren't thinking, oh, you know, this person spent 17 years in a camp. You know, wouldn't you want a better life? They're thinking they're just coming here for a specific purpose to make their lives better economically. Not that they're fleeing persecution, there's danger, there's all sorts of other issues around it. And it's that naivety, if you like, that springs from people not understanding what it's like to be a refugee. And there is a link, of course, between refugee and being a migrant. I mean, you know, the people that went into Greece, it was stated that they were migrants. I mean, they risked their lives and they were sent off to Turkey. I mean, you know, that little boy that got washed up on the shore, that everybody was, you know, they were classed initially as migrants. I mean, you know, but they were refugees, and that's the point I'm making, that people aren't differentiate between what's a migrant and what is a refugee.
So I was actually going to start this conversation, I should have, with exactly this question about the difference between a refugee and an immigrant, the way we typically think of immigrants in this country. Because if you think about much of the rhetoric, it's actually oriented towards, I think, immigrants and migrants much more than refugees. And so then it's a question of, you know, how much distinction is made, and how visible is the refugee issue at all, right? So I'm wondering, you know, if you have thoughts, or if there have been information about the awareness that the American public has on the distinction and what we're doing in terms of refugees.
You want a non-political answer?
Any answer you want. Any answer you want.
Non-politically. I think that there's a lack of education overall about what is a refugee, how do they get here. I'm sure many people do not know that the Homeland Security is even involved in the process, with the vetting process. And I remember about a year ago, there were governors that would come out on the media and say, I'm not accepting refugees in my state. So you can't do that because it's a federal decision, but the governor, for some reason, there was this movement, many governors that came out and said, I'm not going to allow refugees in my state, as if they were protecting their state from something dangerous. So it's very difficult already to raise awareness, raise education, levels of education. But then when you have people in power that make these type of statements, then it does clash, and it puts citizens, makes citizens feel unsafe. Yes, you know, my grandparents came here as refugees, or my great-grandparents were once immigrants, but today, if the governor says they're not going to accept Syrian refugees in my state, then maybe they're protecting me from something. So I think that's where the fear.
So I'll speak explicitly to this, right? So this fear is not random, right? The fear is of terrorism, and the idea that most of the terrorists that we pay attention to, the belief is that they come from that part of the world, and that getting to the United States is difficult because it's so far away, and so people, rightly or wrongly, perceive the refugee resettlement program as an opportunity to plant people in this country who can then do bad things. I think that's the fear, and I guess the question is, and you know, Ehsan, you guys do the screening. Like, what is the likelihood that that actually could happen, right? Like, how likely is it that someone could get through all of our screens and then turn around and do sort of terrorist things?
Well, there's always a chance that something could happen, but the vetting process is extremely thorough. And for Syrian refugees, it's even more thorough. I mean, it's as thorough as we can make it, given what these folks are experiencing. It's quite thorough. In fact, a person traveling, a person requesting refugee status into the United States undergoes a level of screening that no other traveler of any kind coming to the United States undergoes. And we have over 550 million travelers to the United States on a yearly basis. And we have a few thousand that are undergoing an extreme vetting. Very, that's a non-politicized phrase. I'm just using the word extreme, in its general context. And the other thing to note is that the majority of refugees, especially from Syria, that are being resettled are women and children. They are the primary victims of what's happening in those countries.
So I wanted to just be explicit on this, because rather than talk around, I think it's important to get to that point. And I also think it's important for all of us to remember that in the last few years, all the terrorist things that have happened in this country have been by homegrown people who are here already. And so this notion of the other as the perpetrator of violence here is something that we should be reminding ourselves is not actually true. And so I think that kind of discussion, and we've actually had some programs with Bedrosian on this that you might go online and look at to talk about this. And the Safe Communities Institute actually does a lot on homegrown extremism and terrorism. And there's a lot more of it than people know or people are sensitive to. And it's something that as we think about who is going to be in the us versus the them, and who represents threat versus not threat, being mindful of all these nuances, I think is really, really important. I want to ask, we've talked a lot about sort of the demagoguery around this, the rhetoric that that refugees are dangerous, they're a problem. And Cherry, you said something that was very interesting about the notion that there's a feeling that people don't deserve the assistance. And I'm wondering if you think, well, first of all, do you think that's I'm wondering if the other two panelists, Maimouna and Ehsan, do you think that is a driver, a main driver of opposition? And then I'm wondering if you think it's gotten tougher to locate refugees in the last 3 or 4 years. You can answer either question. You don't have to.
What do you mean by locate refugees?
So to resettle them.
Oh, okay.
Right. So has it gotten tougher for refugees to find welcoming places in local communities? So the federal government says, we're going to accept 85,000. Right. They're going to get distributed around the country. Has the willingness and the welcoming nature of communities gotten diminished because of the rhetoric? Like, how is this rhetoric affecting us in real time?
I think at the TF Foundation, we actually have more people that are interested in helping. So I guess a lot of the volunteers that we meet nowadays, they Google the word refugees in Orange County and immediately apply to work as family mentors or soccer coaches. So since this rhetoric has been happening, I've actually seen a higher increase of people wanting to help. But I think it's in response to conversations they're having at work or at home with different people. And that doesn't mean that they're not afraid. So even during the interview process, they would ask certain questions that I would find alarming, but the fact that they asked, shows us or it indicates that they do want to help or they are curious.
There's certainly places where There might be instances of diminished interest, but what I've seen traveling around the country is a lot of interest in accepting and working with refugees, especially with faith-based organizations. Faith-based organizations have really taken a leadership role in the United States in working with and helping to resettle refugees, especially after the government's assistance terminates after that point.
So the question is, when you're going through the refugee resettlement and relocation process in the camps, how do you get chosen, and then how do you wind up getting to the U.S.?
Well, I could give you a story. So there's my mother's cousin. He, his wife, 3 children, ended up in refugee camp in Kenya. So they went from, the children were born in Kenya. So they went from Ethiopia to Somalia to Kenya, had their kids. That's where they were till the mother and 2 daughters. So the 3 kids, the 2 daughters, they were able to be resettled, and the dad and the son had to stay in Kenya, and they were actually separated for about 7 years.
So can I just interject there? So when you say they were able to be resettled, what does that mean? Does it mean that everyone put their name individually on a list? Were names put on the women on one and the men on another? Was it women with children? Like, how exactly would it happen that a family would get split like that?
I think my mother applied as a sponsor for the whole family as a unit, and then they were all interviewed. And then during the interview process, whoever made that decision decided that the mother and the 2 daughters could go, but the father and son had to stay, and they were actually separated for about 7 years, and he was just resettled with his son this past September. So while he was waiting, he had to go through several interview processes as well, to the point that they even had to do a blood test to prove that the mother was really the mother, but she was here in the States. So I don't know if that answers the question, but
in part, and I want to get to the next part of the question, all right? So suppose you're in a camp and you're on a list and you do the interview. There's a decision that you're among the eligible to be resettled. Then the question is, I would presume that in any given year, more than 85,000 people want to come to the United States. How do we decide of the ones who are eligible to be resettled, which ones actually get to go? Do you know the answer?
There's not one answer. So there's a lot of criterias. I mean, we look at the country conditions, we look at the need of the specific individuals, there's a background and vetting process that takes place. And that
on top of the interview that happens in the camp.
Correct, yeah. I mean, these are all a series of interviews, and they're looking at various pieces of the pie, so to speak. And all of those kind of come together. It's a tough decision, right? I mean, this year we're going to take and we're planning on taking 110,000 refugees. But these are tough decisions. I mean, even decisions such as the ability for somebody to travel that long of a distance is taken into account as well. So these are not easy decisions to, essentially turn people away.
So it's a sequence of circumstances,
yeah.
And all the dominoes have to fall exactly the right way for you to get through and ultimately
Plus,
get
as well, if when they're being interviewed as well, mental health is taken into consideration. Health is taken into consideration. Now, if you think that you've been in a camp for a very long time, you're not getting the health care that one thinks you should be having. Plus, there's all sorts of other elements in a camp. Malnourished children. There's all sorts of difficulties. So, it's really you're not in a level playing field looking at people who are totally okay in what they would regard as normal terms to actually come here. So I think that you're right in saying that there's lots of different criteria. I know for the British government we have several criteria, and that is extended continually. I mean, sometimes I'm amazed where they get their criteria from, but they're obviously ones that politically people, you know, whether one wishes to talk about politics or not, politics is actually at the heart of this, believe me. If there's a political will, people do it. Look at Angela Merkel in Germany. She took 1,000,001 refugees into Germany, and there was literally an outcry. Okay, she nearly lost her place as chancellor because of the way.
She may still.
She may still, and that's because, like I've said before, it isn't a political winner in that regard. People see it as, you know, their resources are being threatened, what they have themselves that they've worked really hard for, you know, will be taken away. They don't look at the other issue, what refugees are migrants, because sometimes, of course, migrants are let in too because they're looking for an economical situation that's better than the one they have. And in wars as well, if you think about it, at the moment in Ethiopia, the whole country, I was looking at the UN statistics last night, is devastated. People can't grow, you know, the basic food that they actually need. I mean, you know, how can that be? You know, they mightn't be fleeing directly there and then, but they're in a famine situation where they can't feed themselves. So in the end, I think what is needed is for the country to understand, right? They need to understand the serious nature. We can't be, as human beings, look at it as a bystander. You know, we see the political argument relating to America at the moment in the elections, and I think that's, you know, that's interesting to me. I see that, you know, Hillary has made the argument about 10,000, but there's a resistance from Donald Trump to have nobody here because of the crisis he feels relating to the fact that they're terrorists. So in people's minds, there's that mindset that they're thinking like that. There is a thought process that is going on that refugees equal not here.
So I think it's actually more complicated than that.
Well, I'm glad you think that.
Because no, I mean I would say that, you know, this country has had a long ebb and flow history about the extent to which it wants to engage in the world, and you know it's easier for us to have that viewpoint because we're only attached to the world directly in two places, Mexico and Canada, and then everywhere else, you know, it's very hard to get here. So it's easy to be isolationist, and I think if you go to many parts of the country, you know, they may never have even left their state or their county, let alone to view themselves as a world citizen. And in Europe, it's a much more difficult pathway to ignore that proximity and that commonality just by virtue of the geography. And I think that, you know, one of the things I've often said is that I think every American would do well to be forced to go and live overseas as a minority somewhere for a week. I don't think it would have to be very long for people to have a different appreciation about who we are as a species and who we're going to be as a society. I think that's really important. So thank you for that. I have a question right there. So we had 3 questions. One is, what kind of support systems exist in camps? So are there educational resources such as online or other things for people, given that they may be there for a long time? The second is how is identity maintained in these camps so that we can track people and understand sort of what's going on? And then the third is why don't the immigrants and the refugees who come here and are successful step forward and say, look, I'm an example of what the possibility is. Don't be so afraid.
Well,
you can jump on any of those.
Both of us are stepping forward to a certain extent on the last question. I mean, one of the things that we did with the secretary is to go through, and I think you mentioned this as well, was, you know, kind of changing the image perception. I mean, Albert Einstein was a refugee, Elie Wiesel. Nadia Comaneci. I mean, I can go on in terms of folks that have achieved great fame and fortune. So we wanted to have kind of one element of, you can come to the United States as a refugee and do really well and become a national hero. But that's not the only way you can contribute to society as an American. We also mentioned, with the Secretary, we did a number of videos where he just talks with families that have come overseas that are not Albert Einstein, but are nonetheless refugees, and they're contributing to the United States. And we discuss some of the challenges that they're also going through. We discuss, my dad, when he came in, somebody mentioned about education, and he did, I think it was you, he had graduate degrees, several graduate degrees, of which none were accepted in the United States. And he had to work, in Target, which I thought was great because I got a lot of free candy. But he had to, and he was embarrassed. But he worked in Target for a long time, and then went back to school, went back to UCLA, I'm proud to say, and got again. It's a family thing with us, But we try to share those kind of narratives as well. So I think that goes to your last question.
Yeah, and I believe anyone in the room could correct me, but I think there's acculturation workshops that happen at the refugee camps before they're resettled to their new country. So they'll learn the basics of the U.S. before arriving. So they probably won't know about like the LA freeways and traffic and all that stuff, but they'll have like the basic understanding.
And there's some similar work that happens here once the refugees arrive to the United States as well.
And then, And then there was a second part to your question about how they're identified. They have an I-94. So that I-94 actually allows them to work and have residency. So after 12 months, they can then apply for a green card.
And I suppose, too, it depends on which camp you're in, I should imagine. Some camps, some refugee camps, depending who the NGOs are, that are more engaged than others. So, a lot of it depends. Like, I wouldn't want to send anybody to Calais, and think that, that they were going to be okay. There's lots of things at play here. It's not just one thing. There's lots of difficulty that one has to overcome.
So the question is, do health challenges help you or hurt you in terms of the queue for getting out of these camps?
There's a health screening that takes place once you're accepted, and medical care is provided to you, but the fact that you are disabled does not hurt you from getting accepted as a refugee.
I was going to say that on the issue, I would think that a lot of it is looked at in who you actually have as an advocate for you. I certainly know that in some of the camps it depends. I mean, like there's been a debate in Britain currently with some children, again in the Calais camp. And they have close ties in Britain. And because the Archbishop of Canterbury has actually taken it up, the whole situation is moving quite quickly. And that's the point. It's who you actually have on your side in a way, which shouldn't be the issue overall. It should be how everything could be dealt in a more equitable way. But depends where you are, who is advocating for you, and how the system is actually working, and whether or not at that particular time things are good. Like, for example, when that little boy, were washed up on the beaches. Well, Britain had more people interested in the refugees than they've ever had before. And the whole thing, people were setting up car boot sales, they were doing all sorts of pro-activities because they couldn't possibly think that something like that was happening. Yet in that same day, 12 people were drowned in that same instance. And the day before, there were more people drowned. So it's such a complex issue all around. I think if I was to say anything about all of this, one of the key issues, I think, is that education an understanding of what people who are fleeing all these multitudes of issues can actually do in a country and in a community. And, you know, they come with good majority of people are just like us. And I think when people start to see them and us, I think that causes a lot of issues and a lot of difficulties. And the same with the issue of disability and the same with the issue of mental health. I mean, it's, you know, all these things are a struggle within a camp because you're not getting the proper medication one needs to be able to function in the way you should be functioning. So there's a multitudes of situations there, really.
Brian King, second year student, School of Education. I think you might answer my question. Two things. I heard the 4.2 million number was much higher, even more than double. But also, well, I hear it from different sources, but it sounds to me like depends on what camp you're in, of how lucky you're going to be. Because the whole thing sounds really unfair. I mean, I watched video of the jungle and I couldn't believe what I was watching. But there's camps and people are coming from everywhere, and it just seems like, depending on where you're at, will change everything and what camp you're in.
So I'll interject because I think she did answer that question. I think that's true. That's actually true for everything, right? That's true for healthcare in the United States. It's true for the school system you go to, whether you get mentors. So there is a more general human condition around, you know, equitable distribution of resources. And that's one of the reasons why we have policy, right? To try to make sure that we don't get too, well, in my perception, don't get too out of balance in terms of the inequities and inequalities and access to the things that we need to have. So we have time for one more question. I'll go to you right there. So the question is, what can students do to help improve the situation?
I think the biggest dilemma or the biggest challenge is affordable housing, and that affects a lot of people, not just refugees. So that could be something you could look into. I also think ideas that help refugees enter the workforce quicker.
And
That's all. I don't know. Those are the two.
Well, that was
employment
an opportunity
housing.
for you to give a commercial to yourself, right?
Oh, okay.
So you said your organization came out of a thesis that you did.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So I would say you can look external for solutions, but you can also look internal, right? And there's a real opportunity for you to find those innovative pathways and then convince people to support it. And we have an example of a great outcome that then gives back completely. You wanted to jump in, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. I mean, I think one of the easiest things that young people can do is that's high impact and low cost is spread the word. So you've heard so much from us about misperceptions that people have. I mean, and young people have a unique ability of being able to share and communicate information much faster than older people, and in much more novel ways. We have a project in another space that we work on in violent extremism where we started a competition with young adults from different universities, and they came up with different apps and different software and things like that to actually combat violent extremism. And it's a program we've been running now for 3 years, and it was a student idea. And we hired many of those students that came up with this, and we implemented this program. It's because students approached us. So if you're interested, approach me afterwards. We also have internships at our office. And so we're always looking for graduate interns in public policy or law. So if you're interested in interning with us and implementing some of the ideas you have, DHS is a very flat organization when it comes to the federal government. It's one of the least, if not one of the lesser bureaucratic organizations. So if you have an interesting idea, especially relating to refugees, I encourage you to come up and talk to me.
So he took up the commercial.
I just wanted to say that collective action among students is one of the most mobilizing situation. And apart from all that's been mentioned, I think that, you are the future, and public perception is also the key to some of these naivety that people have. But I do think collective action is the way forward. Right on.
All right, we're just about out of time, and I wanted to make sure to give each of our speakers an opportunity to say a few last comments if you have them. So
I will
Hassan?
just mention one kind of closing statement. I think I've said more than enough. A, thank you for being here. Please spread the word about what you've learned here today, especially as it relates to refugees. And two, I will say that I have two additional colleagues here with me. They're the two young women sitting there in the back. They're from DHS, and they also work on this issue on different parts of this issue. So if you do have additional questions, I'm going to stick around at the end, and I think they'll be available as well for a few minutes to answer questions or get you some more information. Thank you again. And thank you, Raphael and Frank, for having us.
Yes. Yeah, I'd like to say that as difficult as the process is, as hard as it is to educate the masses about refugees, a lot of people do care. They actually want to do something. They want to give back. And if you're interested in volunteering or becoming a family mentor, I do recommend signing up with the TIA Foundation. We provide about 2 weeks of thorough training before you even meet the family you work with. And I've seen it benefit not only the families we work with, but also the volunteers. And TIA is designed for individuals that have no experience working with the refugee population. It's done intentionally because it's a bigger audience here in Southern California. So I'll stick around as well if any of you want to talk. And we're also in discussion. We're also in discussion of starting a student organization here on campus called Fresh Start, which stands for Students Together Aiding Refugees Today. Yep. TIA has established a group at UC Irvine. We have a group at UCLA, and we have the intention of starting here on campus as well, if you're interested in doing something here on your campus.
Right. Student mobilizing, wonderful, and people in general mobilizing. That's superb. I think that one has to, in the wider picture, one has to remember that there's 65 million refugees in the world today, and 41 million of these are children. Some of them unaccompanied, young, very young children. Through to no fault of their own. And 34,000 people each day has become refugees. So, just using those sort of statistics from the UN, I mean, it just says something in our hearts and minds, and that we do need to do something about it. And whatever small thing one can do, if it's actually just giving, $1 here and $1 there, I mean, that is very meaningful. But to raise the awareness, like we've done today, the Bedrosian Center and Safer Communities, I think that gives it a sense of perspective, because I'm sure, it's not something that we concentrate on every day, but if it just, in our thinking, that we have it there in our minds, then, once you have brought it to the forefront, then, you look at it in a different way. You watch telly in a different way when you see the refugee crisis and things, because you're already starting to open your minds to it. And I think that's a really important point. So thank you very much for asking me to this debate, Frank. And Audrey, I do wondered sometimes if I had anything to offer. So,
well, I think we answered that question. So I also want to thank all of you for being here. I hope that you are regular to Bedrosian Center events and also Safe Community Initiative events. And if you're not, please do get on both mailing lists so that you're aware of the things that we do. All of our programs are like this. So we try to keep them interesting, interactive, and thought-provoking, and to give you things to take with you and percolate in your minds. I wanted to do one thing before I let you all go, which is to thank Aubrey Hicks, who is sitting here. She's the executive director of the Bedrosian Center and puts these things together, make sure we have food and all that kind of stuff. So thank you, Aubrey. But I also really want to thank my fellow panelists. It's been my privilege to have this conversation with you, Ehsan Zafar, or maybe we should just call you Ehsan Hussein. Go back to your real name. Mayuma Hussein Katan, and Dr. Cherry Short. Thank you. It's really been a pleasure. And thank you all for being a part of this.